All right, geez, I almost did it again. All right, this is going to be a fun video, at least I think so, comparing three different speakers at three different price tiers. And before anybody even replies in the comment section, actually, please do. It helps the algorithm. Um, the reason that I chose these is because of the price staggers. So we've got the pair of KEF Concerto Q Metas for about $1,300 a pair. We got the MoFi Source Point Triple Eights for about $5,000 a pair. And then we've got the KEF Blade 2 Meta at about $29,000 per pair. Now, each of these are all, at least in my opinion, and the data really backs this up, class leaders in their price range. The real question is, what do you gain when you go from spending $1,300 to $5,000, from the KEF Concerto to the MoFi Source Point Triple Eight, or $5,000 to $29,000 going from the Triple Eights to the KEF Blade 2 Metas? That's the real question. Now, obviously, we can say that the Blade 2 Metas look different. They have a more, I don't know if industrial is the right, I don't think that's the right word, but a more architectural type look. You know, they just, man, they look cool. At least I think so. I know some people don't like them, so it's one of those love-hate things. Then you go down to the MoFi Source Point Triple Eights, and I think they look really cool. They got a nice walnut finish, but they don't look as sleek. I mean, let's just say that you've got some money and you've got a nice home setup. You're probably not going to put a standard box speaker in your nice, well-to-do living room. I mean, I'm just saying, right? And then you step down to the KEF Concerto Q Meta, and it's a bookshelf speaker of veneer finish on it, a couple different colors, and it looks good, especially for its price. But we know that sometimes we pay just for the looks. And I'll say this anecdotally. In my time reviewing speakers and listening to speakers and looking at test data and evaluating the price versus the overall objective performance, and then trying to suss out, what am I paying for looks versus objective performance, I really have found that the sweet spot for performance without looks or without aesthetics is around $500 to $1,000 per pair. You can get some really good speakers for that price range. It's usually going to be bookshelf speakers though. And then when you step outside of $1,000 and go up in price, you're paying more and more for looks, and not necessarily less and less for performance, but you can take a speaker that costs $500 in a flat MDF enclosure, maybe with some veneer or something like that, and then slap some gloss on it and make it look fantastic, but have the same performance, and it might cost you twice as much. So again, that's why I say my sweet spot for recommendations for actual performance, not concerning aesthetics, is going to be about $500 to $1,000. Now that's with 250 different speakers tested under my belt. I've done almost 50 to 60 this year alone. So take that for what it's worth, but understand that that's backed up with a lot of experience here. Before we dive into looking at some of the data and kind of evaluating the objective performance of these speakers, I want to go through a couple quick things, and really two things. One is going to be my overall takeaway from how the speakers sound and how they perform. But first, we're going to actually listen to sound clips. Now, I've already discussed how I set up sound clips, how I extract them. If you want to understand that and you have a question concerning that, just watch the video up here in the corner, or I'll drop it in the description below. With that said, we're going to play the original track. Then we're going to play the speaker version of that track. And I'm going to do that for each of these three speakers. So you're going to have some time to listen to it. We're going to play some pink noise because that really shows the differences more readily. If I chose a music track, then some things might be highlighted, others might not be highlighted. It's hard to cover that broad spectrum. So we're going to listen to pink noise. If you got a problem with that, man, take it up with the complaint department. I've got a long line of people just like you worried about that stuff, okay? So with that said, let's go ahead and kick off these sound demos. Now that we've done that, let's briefly talk about my subjective takeaway. With the KEF Concerto Q Meta, one thing I tended to notice is that in the room, now the sound demos don't really factor in the radiation pattern or reflections of the wall. It's just the anechoic on axis response. But in the room, these speakers are designed to have a nice linear tilt. The on axis response is going to sound a little bit different. I tend to find that I target a nice linear in-room response over a flat on-axis response. And there's ways to go about designing a speaker to achieve that or to achieve the vice versa of that. We got to understand that speakers are much, much more than just the flat on-axis response paradigm that we put ourselves into. There are things that go on to the side of the speaker, basically, that really matter and maybe matter as much. Some could argue maybe more, depending on the room. So the KEF Concerto Q, personally, I tend to find the speaker maybe a bit dark. The reason for that is because its radiation pattern kind of narrows up in the higher frequency. Most speakers do this, but maybe this one is maybe a little bit more narrow than others. However, it doesn't narrow up like some speakers do that you're going to see on this list. It's just the MoFi 888. I'll just go ahead and tell you now, in the highest frequency, okay? So what I tend to find is that while the overall tonal balance of the Concerto Q Meta, is really quite nice, there's just not a lot of overall envelopment from this particular speaker, and I want a little bit more. Now, if you're listening in a smaller room with reflective surfaces nearby, you're going to be okay. If you are listening in a very wide open room or you go to demo these in a showroom that doesn't have walls nearby, you're probably going to find the same thing that I found, where it just doesn't sound spacious enough. Moving on to the 888, personally, I find that this speaker maybe lacks a little bit of bite in the upper mid-range. There is a little bit of hollowness in the mid-range portion itself, but we're talking like a decibel. So you're really only going to notice it when you're comparing A to B, like you did with the Pink Noise full original track versus the impulse response speaker version of that. So you heard a difference. Would you hear a difference if you were listening to that speaker on your own, devoid of any reference? You might not. If you have golden ears, you might. The thing that I do like about the 888, though, is it seems to have a little bit more envelopment, especially through the maybe mid-range, upper mid-range. And overall, it sounds a little bit more spacious. It also gets down to about 30 hertz in room, where the KEF Concerto 2, I don't even remember now. I think it rolls off at somewhere like around maybe 40 to 50 hertz or so, give or take. Now we can move on to the KEF Blade 2 Meta. This sucker is like 5 to 6 times the price of the 888. Now the Blade 2 Meta to me is a little bit more narrow than the 888, but it still has a good deal of spaciousness to it. And the reason for that is because it is linear on axis, but it has excellent, like class leading, probably the best I've ever seen, heard, or measured directivity, which just means that the profile of the sound radiation going to the side of the speaker and above and below it is extremely similar to the direct sound on axis. Now, this is another speaker where if you listen to it in a demo showroom floor that has no sidewalls, you may find that it doesn't have the enveloping sound that you really are after. It's not a whole lot more narrow than the 888 that we just looked at, but the 888 does have a bit more spaciousness to it. Still, the KEF Blade 2 Meta is extremely linear speaker, and again, best in class that I've come across as well. So now that we've talked about that, let's actually go and look at the data, and then I'll allow you to understand why you heard what you heard in the sound clips. This is the frequency response for the KEF Concerto Q Meta. So mid-range overall is mostly okay. You've got a dip around 200 hertz, so male vocals may not quite sound as chesty as maybe a flat on-axis response. The high frequency, however, is down about 2 to maybe 3 decibels compared to the mid-range. So you certainly should have noticed that difference. Again, when you put the speaker in the room, things are going to change. We'll talk about that in a little bit. The bass response, F3 at 53 hertz and F10 at 35 hertz. So you're rolling off around 40 to 50 hertz, and the sensitivity is at about 84.2 decibels. The 888 sensitivity is about 85.6, so a little bit more sensitive. Its linearity is a little bit better in terms of matching the average SPL in the mid-range to the tweeter, but you see that in terms of linearity, there are some dips and peaks and a bit of some diffraction profiles we have going on with this speaker. Did you hear that in the sound clip? Let me know. F3 at 34, F10 is at 26 hertz. So this speaker gets down to about 30 hertz in room without much fuss. Now moving on to the Blade 2 Meta, we can see that this speaker's average sensitivity is about 86.8 decibels, and it is extremely linear. For a passive speaker, this is probably about as good as you're going to get. There are some other passive speakers that are also very linear, and they do also get down to maybe about the mid 40s or so in room. But the problem with those is that maybe they give up something else, maybe in terms of directivity. Vertical directivity really is one where you sit at the tweeter, but what happens when you go above or below it and the sound starts to really drop out? You don't have that with this speaker. I'll talk about that in a little bit as well. Now let's talk about the CEA 2034 data. And I really like to focus on the directivity. The directivity gives us an idea of, as you go from the front of the speaker to the back of the speaker, how are the direct sound different from the reflected sounds? And if they're vastly different, which would show up as a nonlinearity through either of these lines, then you know that the reflections are going to sound a lot different than the direct sound. And that's going to mess up things timbrally, or tonally, if you like that word better. By the way, timbre is spelled like timber, and it really bothers me. Okay. So let's see what happens when I draw this line. For the early reflections, we can see that there are some areas where it kind of stands out above this line. So it's not quite linear. Now, what about the 888? 888, same thing. We see that if I draw a line, it's not quite linear. There's a little bit of a deviation in the, what is this, mid-range area, and a little bit, in the upper mid-range, lower treble. Not a big difference, but, it's noticeable. What about the Blade 2 Meta? Look at that. It's almost not a flat line, but it's almost a perfect line. For a passive speaker, again, I know I haven't seen better than this for a passive speaker. It's incredible. Now, the directivity, the reason that this matters again is because you want the sound reflected off the walls to sound the same as the sound that hits your ears first. Now, going back to my example about putting the speaker in a room versus a showroom floor with no walls, if you don't have the benefit of those reflections off the wall, then the soundstage may sound like it's kind of small, narrow, and it doesn't really collapse. The other factor is just the actual soundstage radiation width. So we're going to talk about that here. With the KEF Q Concerto, we can see that the horizontal maybe is about plus or minus 55 degrees. I mean, it just kind of depends on how I draw this line, but we do see that it's narrowing with higher frequency. That's somewhat typical, unless it's a constant directivity speaker, which none of these are. Now, if we look at the source point 888, we can see that it's a little bit wider, but at the top end, it narrows up pretty quickly. Are you going to notice this frequency narrowing up above like 12 kilohertz? Probably not. Now we go to the Blade 2 Meta. This thing is practically textbook. It is a little bit more narrow than the 888, but the directivity on it is class leading. What about the vertical response? This is where things really start to get separated. For the Q Concerto Meta, you can see if I'm trying to look at this -6 dB line, which is this shade of red right here, then there's definitely some deviations, right? So handing off from maybe the midwoofer to the coaxial driver above it, there's a dip here in the vertical response. And then there's a little bit of a bloom here going on around 2 to 3 kilohertz. Now we move on to the source point 888, and we can see a similar kind of effect. But the other thing I want to call attention to is, see all these little lines bouncing out? That's diffraction. Are you going to notice those kind of diffractions in the vertical plane? I got to be honest, I don't know. I really don't know for sure. But in terms of engineering, if we're talking about where does your money go, then when we flip over to the Blade 2 Meta, as you see here, it's incredible. Vertical response is incredible. Wide window. So with all these speakers, you can pretty much kind of stand, walk around. They're all good speakers for entertainment and things like that. They have a wide horizontal and a wide vertical window, especially vertical. Because again, if you're sitting on the couch listening and then you want to stand up and walk to the kitchen or something like that, then you're going to hear essentially the same sound. Earlier, I talked about the difference between the on-axis sound and the estimated in-room response, or basically like the reflected sound. What this graph does is it gives you an idea of how the tonality of the speaker is going to be in a typical room with sidewall reflections, floor and ceiling reflections. And in my experience, this is excellent for determining the general tonal balance of the speaker. So we can see with the KEF Q Concerto, we get about 50 hertz in room extension, mild upper mid bass dip right through here. So again, it may take away from some chestiness of the vocals. And you can also see that this slope is pretty tilted down. So this is why I would say that this speaker might sound a little bit dark to some people. Now, if we go to the 888, we can see that this slope is more mellow. This is indicative of this speaker's wider horizontal dispersion pattern. But we see a couple little areas in here that may make you go, ooh, that maybe not quite so linear. Some slight hollowness in the vocals around 600 hertz, missing a little bit of attack or detail in this upper mid-range, lower treble region. Did you hear that when you were listening to the sound clips? Now the KEF Blade 2 Meta. Really excellent linearity. And I'm seriously nitpicking this right here because I'm trying to be fair to the other items that I reviewed. If I'm going to call them out for having a little bit of a dip or a bump, I got to do that for the Blade 2 Meta, even though it's like a decibel or a half a decibel. And I would I would be really surprised if anybody heard this difference. Now, if I look at the extension about 30 hertz in room, notice this bass profile is a little bit different. There's a little bit of a dip around 40 to 50 hertz. And then if I go back up to the MoFi source point 888, it's a little bit more filled in there. Now, the difference here would probably mean that you could theoretically get away with putting the Blade 2 Meta a little bit closer to the wall than you could the source point 888. The 888 is going to need a little bit more room to breathe. And these are also factors we have to consider when we buy a speaker. Now let's talk about compression and distortion. With the Q Concerto Meta, compression looks pretty good. And then if I go to the 888, it looks better. So there's a lot of dynamic range with this speaker. And then the Blade 2 Meta, it's even better. So a ton of dynamic range with this particular speaker. Now let's talk about multi-tone distortion, or distortion that you're going to get by playing practically real music. This 3% line is my personal threshold, and this is based off of a lot of experimentation. I tend to find that 3% is kind of the point where things start sounding a little bit more grainy. And because of that, you start noticing that distortion element to it. If we go to the 888, it's lower. Hey, your money, that $5,000, this is where it's starting to show up at. And then if we go to the Blade 2 Meta, it's even lower, especially through the mid-range area. So this is another area where the performance is actually improved, but the performance was also improved with the linearity of the Blade 2 Meta. That does it for this video. I hope you learned something. This was fun for me to kind of go back through these things and try to compare price tiers. You know, what do you get as you spend more money? Now, just my final thoughts on this are the Concerto Q Meta at $1,300, class leading. Seriously, it's an excellent value, but it might sound a little bit dark. To some people and other reviewers I've noticed mention this, it doesn't really tickle their fancy because it doesn't have boosted high frequency. With that said, that's one reason why some people might not like the KEF Q Concerto. But if you're looking for something that's very linear, and especially if you have a smaller room, it's a great buy. But if you step up to the 888, you're going to get a lot more bass. You're going to gain maybe some more linearity, not a whole lot. You're going to gain a little bit more sensitivity. But to me, the biggest factor is you're going to gain more output, much lower distortion, and you're going to gain a little bit wider radiation horizontally. And I like that feature. Then if you spend 5 times as much, again, because you went from $13,000 to $5,000 and now you're going up to $29,000. So that's almost, oh shoot, that's almost 6 times as much. My bad. You are getting better performance. You're getting better linearity for sure. Much lower diffraction elements vertically and horizontally. A little bit more narrow radiation, and roughly the same bass extension as the 888. But you're also getting a much more aesthetically friendly look for maybe a certain type of home. Now, some of you may prefer the look of the 888. I think the 888 looks fantastic, but I also like the Blade 2 Meta. I think that it looks awesome. And if I can quickly fall back on my own subjective take, what the Blade 2 Meta does, and I have some ideas of how to correlate this to the measurements, and we've kind of touched on them. It presents such a cohesive soundstage. Everything is so freaking point source that the first time I heard them, I was like, oh my God, I've not heard a speaker that sounds like this in this way. Now, tonally, would you possibly like something else? For sure. In terms of spaciousness, would you possibly like something else? For sure. Maybe you like a wider radiating speaker. That's okay. But I have yet to hear a speaker put everything on the same plane and have so much layering, variable with the recording, of course, as the KEF Blade 2 Meta. And that's why it still is, and I've heard $100,000 speakers at this point, it still is my quote unquote end game speaker. I mean, if I had that money, that's the speaker that I would buy. But maybe you wouldn't. And now hopefully you have a better appreciation for what does the cost differences get you. And if we take away just the looks and focus on the objective data here, you can see that you are getting better performance, but the envelope of performance is getting down a little bit less and less with each incremental step, or maybe even large jumps. Okay. So if you enjoyed this video, if you enjoy what I do, make sure you leave a like and a comment below. That would certainly be helpful. If you'd like to support what I'm doing, you can join me at patreon.com/Aaron's Audio Corner, or you can use any of my generic affiliate links below. They're not a link directly to anything in particular. It's just a generic affiliate link that takes you to the store and you buy whatever it is that you want to buy from Amazon, Crutchfield, Audio Advice, Best Buy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that helps me out a lot. I certainly appreciate it. I will talk to you all in the next video. Take care. Peace.